everyone, so this is an acrylic portrait tutorial for beginners. First, I start out by creating a grid on my canvas that will match the grid on the photo that we're using. Gridding is really helpful when people are beginners or learning to draw because you can focus on a smaller space, which are the individual boxes, and can more easily see proportion and angles relative to the perpendicular lines of the grid. I also recommend that in general, even if you are using a grid, you are also challenging yourself to improve your drawing skills so that you eventually don't have to use a grid. I sometimes still use a grid just because it speeds the execution of my drawing and I can get to painting, which I find more fun and rewarding. I create the grid on the photo by using an app I found, but you can also add a grid on your computer or print out the photo and create your own grid. I actually recommend printing the photo in both color and black and white rather than using a photo on a computer if you can. The important thing is to now create the grid that fits the same ratio as the photo and make sure they are equal boxes. So if there are 4 horizontal boxes and 5 vertical boxes on your photo, then you have to choose a canvas that allows you to have the same ratio. For example, this is an 8x10 canvas, so I can have that ratio by making 2x2 boxes. From here you start drawing. There are a lot of ways to approach this, but I try to get the main angles and shapes of the shadows correct. Sometimes I have to create reference lines and back into the correct shape. I'll explain more as I go. Drawing is actually the most important part of the painting in my opinion. Spending the time to make sure the drawing is how you want it to be, in this case, since we're doing a portrait, that means we want it to be as accurate as possible, is important because it's very hard to correct in later phases and is really the scaffolding of your entire painting is built on. So you see here, I am trying to get that angle of her mouth right. She's got a very slight smile. And so I'm drawing some lines and seeing what does that shadow shape look like in reference to the lines and trying to just get the image to match the angles that I'm seeing. And so I'm creating some reference lines here and saying, okay, you know, this particular shape I'm trying to draw is about 1/3 of the way down the box, and it ends about a little bit more than halfway down the box. And so I'll draw a line between those 2 points and then use that as a reference for everything else I'm drawing as long as I feel like that's accurate. So when I say shadow shapes, I mean the way the shadow falls across the face and how light falls across the face. And a lot of what we perceive about a face is really how those 2 things occur. So rather than asking yourself, is this a nose? Does this look like a cheek? I want you to sort of objectively think about it in your mind. Does this shape look like the shape I'm seeing? And try not to think about it as a face. So one of the things I'm doing here is I'm starting to shade it in. This is really starting to create a value drawing and shading in the shadows. And although these marks will not be shown in the final painting, this is a way to create some notes and work through the value. And when we think about color, we think about 3 things. We think about chroma, value, and temperature. And so value, you can think about that as, you know, the spectrum of black to white, or I should say the gradient of black to white. What is the grayscale? So you can imagine if you turn this into a black and white photo, that's essentially the effect you're trying to get to. I recommend doing this in pencil before going to paint for beginners because it is easier to fix. As you go, you can erase things, you can lighten things up, you can darken things, and you really just take the time to work with it. So I continue to do that here and fill in the shadow shapes and the relative value across the painting. So here I'm happy essentially with where I've landed with this. I work on it a little bit more, but I wanted to show you what I do next. I essentially create grayscale using just black acrylic paint, and you can see here there's different values in the washes, and I start using those washes to go back over the shadows and continue making a value painting. And now since I have all of these notes about what is dark, what is light, relative to each other, it makes it a lot easier to do this value painting. I suggest for beginners building up this color slowly using sort of a lighter gray wash and kind of working in layers, so that way you can kind of build up to the dark. You can also kind of go in and put in your darkest darks with like a darker wash, and it's probably okay. If you do feel like you make a mistake and the value is not quite right, you can always go back with some white paint and mix a gray that you feel like is closer to the value and paint that through instead. But I try to keep it, kind of relatively loose and painterly here, but also make sure that I'm capturing that value and continuing to work up to the right sort of gradient where the darkest darks are dark enough and the lightest are still sort of very light. Having a little piece of paper to test the value of the stroke on before putting on the canvas is also recommended for beginners to reduce the number of mistakes you made, so that way you don't have to kind of do that mixing. So I continue on building up the value and painting in some of the darkest darks until I am happy with the painting and the value. And so this is where I've landed with the value painting before continuing on. Now I'm mixing two colors and using them to make a wash that I'll paint over the canvas. This essentially becomes the mid-tone of the canvas, and you can keep all of your value references underneath. I do this in a really loose way and keep it pretty wet so I can wipe out the lighter parts with a paper towel. I like to have sort of like variation in the colors I'm using as well, because you can kind of see it through the canvas as we add color. Now we start painting in our colors. So first I'm mixing our shadow. I create an orange by mixing yellow and red and then mix in some black to it. When we think of temperature of color, it's a scale of cool to warm. In general, warm shadows tend to look really nice, in my opinion, more realistic, as does reflective natural light that's warm. The photo does have a warm shadow, but I'm going even a little warmer because I like the effect and it's an artistic choice. So I'm painting the shadow into the shadow shapes we created earlier and going a little lighter in some areas where the shadow's value is a little lighter, like for example, where there might be some reflected light in the back of the neck. You can probably see now why the drawing was so important, because all of the steps we've taken so far is really just reinforcing the drawing we already made and changing the color of those shadow shapes and the values that we've already established. From here, I'm going to start mixing up some skin tones. I'm actually mixing two skin tones. One is the average color of the lighter parts of the figure, and one is a lighter value. To get this, I mix in orange with black and white. When I say black, this is ivory black, and it's a black that actually has a blue tinge, which helps to cool down the mixture and be more like a skin tone. If you're using a warmer black, then you may have to add a little bit of blue to get a similar mixture. I go in and I paint in the lighter areas, and because I have two colors for the skin tone right now, just to keep it simple, any area that's lighter, that's not in shadow, I paint with the lighter color, and any color that's darker, that's not in the shadow, I paint with the darker color. Now, there's also a few areas that are sort of between the shadow and this lighter color. I leave those blank for now, and I'll mix a color soon for that, but this gives kind of the foundation of what we're doing. Once I feel pretty good that I've covered the sort of two lightest tones in the skin, I go in and I mix that sort of gradient tone that's between the shadow shape and the light shape. And so you can see that this is a little bit darker. It's not quite in shadow, but it's approaching the shadow. And so I sort of mix this as I go. Acrylic dries very quickly, so you can't do what I think is super helpful in oil painting, which is mix all of your colors up front and then select and maybe adjust as you paint. So with acrylic, you have to be a little strategic and say, what will I paint next and what colors will I need to do it? And then mix those colors in relation to the colors that you already have on your palette so that you can make sure they are relationally accurate. I recommend keeping the colors on your palette in order of value to make this process easier. I unfortunately forgot to take a picture of my palette for this painting, but I have a picture of an oil painting palette to show you what I mean by order, and I'll show you that at the end. I go in and paint the background now using some artistic license here. I like the photo's red lips, so I'm painting the background in red as well, as I think it'll look nice in the painting. But you can keep the background the color of the painting and really make the lips pop, or you can change it to a completely different background if you want. There's lots of choices you can make in doing these types of paintings, so you're not just kind of reproducing it completely and putting your own spin on it. I continue painting and add some of the brighter colors to the face. The saturation of a color is called chroma, so areas with more vibrant color are higher chroma, and areas with less vibrant color are relatively lower chroma. Here, her cheeks have more chroma, especially near the shadow, and her lips are obviously very high chroma with that bright red. So I go in, I do that, I add some of the color to the eyes, and start painting some other areas of the face, the hair, the collar of her shirt. So also I just wanted to note, like I paint in both oil and acrylic, and typically I do my first couple layers in acrylic and then I switch to oil because I like the workability of oil usually. However, I do work in both from time to time. And I wanted to say you can get a pretty similar effect in acrylic as you can in oil. You just can't blend because it dries faster. But a lot of folks would argue that you shouldn't really be blending much with oil anyway, and instead you should be mixing the gradients of colors so that they don't become muddy, which is something you can do with acrylic as well. So I think acrylic is a really great medium, especially if you're starting as an artist and trying to learn how to use the paint. And then I would also recommend, if you can, give oil a try, see which one you like better. Some people love acrylic and hate oil, some people vice versa, some people like both of them and appreciate each medium for what they are. Okay, and so here I continue to paint, and I'm adjusting and checking versus the photo, continuing to make sure I don't lose any of the shadow shapes that I created from before. Okay, here's that palette I promised to show you. So this is from an oil painting I did recently, but you can see that there's, especially in the lighter tones, a lot less jump from color to color, and they're very gradual. And so having that means you don't have to mix as much because you're essentially placing the paint on the canvas that is the next color and the next color. And with oil paint, it kind of like mixes itself, and acrylic can do the same as long as it's still wet. So just something to keep in mind when you're mixing color. If you feel like, oh geez, I really need to blend this, the answer is probably just mixing a different color. So here I'm again continuing to adjust, getting pretty happy with it. Started painting the hair, painted the collar, making little adjustments here and there. This is where I ended up with the finished painting. I'm pretty happy with it. I could continue to add more detail and put some glazing layers with some acrylic and matte or glazing medium, or even just water and acrylic, but this on its own is a finished painting in my view. So I'm really glad that you were able to join me on this tutorial, and I hope it was helpful. Thanks so much. Happy painting.
Join Shanna on September 28th, Sunday, at 1 o'clock Pacific time for her acrylic portrait painting class. In this class, you're going to learn all about how to use acrylics, whether you're new to it or an old hand, and you also learn a lot about portrait painting from the beginning. Again, whether you're a beginner or you have some experience. Her process is unique and wonderful, and I'll be doing it myself. So I look forward to seeing you there. Visit us at www.thejoyofdrawing.org and go to registration to sign up. See you there.